we have every reason to think that they were habitually engaging in communing with non-human persons to gain knowledge, right?
Sure.
For example, with the Pythagoreans or with Empedocles or Parmenides, these are these sort of pre-Plato type philosophers. And this is just a standard thing in ancient culture, by which I mean Greco-Roman culture. This shouldn't surprise us. It was, for some people, it was a daily occurrence. Even if it didn't happen during waking time, it would at least happen in dreams, you know. Now, what kind of knowledge were they gaining? Well,
welcome back to the transmission, my fellow glorious sentient sacks of stardust. There is no way around it. When you dive into the spirituality and philosophy of the ancient world, it is soaked in beings, prophecies, OBEs, NDEs, gods, goddesses, daimones, and I guess I'll say non-ordinary states of consciousness, and we riff on all of the above in this mind meld. And as woo-woo or out there as that may sound, these people who wrote this stuff went on to shape Western thought and philosophy, and eventually the scientific method. You know, Plato, Socrates, Pythagoras, Parmenides. They all had esoteric doctrines, practices, or knowledge that still leaves us just frothingly curious, in my case, and at the very least, scratching our heads. But to stretch the shit out of that metaphor, there are levels, my friends, when it comes to esoteric head scratching, and Earl Fontainelle is an absolute S-tier pro-level esoteric head scratcher. He's a classicist and religious scholar and PhD haver who specializes in the Greco-Roman and Hellenistic flavors of the esoteric, you know, hermeticism, platonism, all the stuff that just really gets my wonder dander up. His show, The Secret History of Western Esotericism, SHWEP, it's been massive for me. Folks, I'm telling you, if you are into this stuff, this show is what you are looking for. I've listened to nearly every, if not every episode, sometimes multiple times. Given that, I'm going to be honest, I'm going to lay my gratitude right on out there. This one was massive for me. Earl is honestly one of the most important teachers I've ever encountered when it comes to this stuff, however non-locally, however unaware he was of me up until we recorded this episode. He's a total treasure. Two final notes. Earl is a faceless creator, so you're going to have to enjoy what I think is a pretty dope avatar I made for him. And also, given the fact that I've spent hundreds of hours nerding out on this stuff and Earl has spent thousands, you may need to hold on to your wonder nuggets a bit at points in this conversation. We do dip in and out of a lot of subjects. We probably use a lot of words, mention a lot of names that you may not be familiar with. But I promise you, if you track with us, if you fill in the blank spots with a quick search, you're going to have a good time. Or at the very least, you're going to have a lot of tasty breadcrumbs to follow. And with that, my friends, all of the links that you'll need for Earl Fontainelle and his fabulous podcasts, the SHWEP, are going to be in the description. Same for Third Eye Drops. And if you like this deep diving esoteric content that you're probably not going to find anywhere else, like, subscribe, comment, share. It is the most important thing you can do to support the channel. Speaking of, we've got hundreds of audio-only podcasts as well, so make sure you subscribe to Third Eye Drops wherever you listen to podcasts. A lot of those episodes are audio-only. They'll never be up here on YouTube. And if you want to support more directly and rap with me and hundreds of other Wonder Dippers who are into this stuff, join up over at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. We've got a patron-only Discord server. You can get rewards like stickers, pins, shirts, and more. We've got a book club. We do monthly Wonder Gym hangs on Zoom. I would love to riff with you there. And speaking of riffing, my friends, let's do so presently with the wise and wonderful Dr. Earl Fontainelle. Earl, as I already said privately, I will do a little public veneration as well. You've been just such a massive resource for me because it's so tricky navigating the waters of the quote unquote esoteric, no matter how you approach it. But what you're doing with your show is just such an amazing antidote to it. And I'll stop babbling in a moment here, but it's like, you called it sort of an act of straddling in terms of being able to be scholarly but also make it accessible. But it's also sort of a straddling act in that you maintain this clear sense of wonder, I feel like, that some other similar outlets that explore these ideas don't, where it's either just pure woo, I'm a practitioner, or it's I'm a scholar, I'm not really even interested in this personally.
Mhm.
But there's this palpable sense of wonder in your show
Yeah.
while you also maintain this scholarly disposition. So it just tickles me in all the right areas, my friend, and I really thank you for it.
I take that as high praise. I really appreciate it. That's kind of what we're trying to do. Yeah, part of the reason scholars of Western esotericism, and this is an artifact of like the history of the field, which is a very
Yeah.
small, short-lived field. Part of the reason I think a lot of them put a filter on their sense of wonder is in pursuit of a respectable scholarly field. Because for a long time, people who were doing serious work on Western esotericism um, would just be asked ridiculous questions like, wait a minute, are you some kind of occultist? Why are you interested in
Right.
this stuff? You know, questions that people who study Judaism or Christianity or Islam or Buddhism or
Right.
whatever, they don't get asked. You're just like, what do you study? I'm a scholar of Judaism. Oh, interesting. Cool. That's a legitimate subject of study. What's going on?
Right.
So
Yeah.
there has been a certain amount of people um, distancing themselves very pointedly from all that which is practitionerish, all that which is sort of insider information. But I think there is a lot of wonderment and delight in Western esoteric materials from the scholars who work on this stuff. They just don't always let it kind of show through.
Well, on that note, there's so many things I would love to riff with you about, but as I promised, um, I've got this weird thing coming up that some listeners know about. I've really not done a a deep dive into what I'm doing with it, but I'm going to be doing this retreat soon at this sort of infamous place called the Monroe Institute. And if people know what that is, they're going to be vaguely familiar with sort of, shadowy goings on that have to do with intelligence agencies, perhaps, and out of body experiences and things like that. But really, when you talk to people from this place, they're like incredibly normal. They really want to distance themselves from that kind of lore and really just encourage people to explore their own consciousness and these layers of consciousness that are there, are accessible, are real. Um, and to some degree, I have to take their word for that because I haven't experienced these things um, directly yet. However, as you well know, in pretty much as far back in history as we can look, tantalizingly similar things exist.
Similar
Um,
to what? Put some meat on the bones of
sure.
what's going on here.
Yeah.
We're talking about out of body experiences, right?
Yes. Tantalizingly similar things to what we could call soul flight or astral projection or out of body experiences. And not only do they exist, they're reported to have been done by some of the people that we now look at as the sort of, if not people who actually ignited the spark of, you know, uh, well-regarded philosophy. They at least inspired the people who lit
Right.
that spark.
Yeah.
If we go back to these Yatromontes figures, these healer-seers is how we would translate that word from my understanding.
Mhm.
They seem to be doing this
Yeah.
all the time.
Routinely. Yeah,
Yeah.
routinely. I mean, it's routine, but it's also special. Like the reason there's all this
Yeah.
lore about them is that it's not something that everyone does in ancient Greek society. It's what they do specifically. But yeah, they do it. They do it a lot. And then we have also cultures off the beaten track of the West
Right.
who seemingly have specialists who've been doing this forever and still have specialists who do this. Their soul leaves their body, goes somewhere else, does some stuff, often for healing purposes, often for bringing back some cool knowledge purposes, often for doing battle with other leaving the body
Mm.
practitioners who might be baddies. So you go and fight them,
Yeah.
you know. This is a thing. It's a thing in pre-Columbian American cultures in a big way. Still goes on in the jungles of Brazil and places like that, or I guess the cities of Brazil, the favelas of Brazil. Um, it We find it in North American cultures pre-Columbian. We find it in the Eurasian steppe. My guess would be it's probably found in lots of African cultures as well, though I'm not so clued in on that. Yeah, it's a thing.
Yeah. 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 And it's a very intriguing thing for me. And I think for anybody who's interested in consciousness, spirituality, what we are potentially beyond the sort of fleshy bits, the
Hmm.
fact I think a lot of people just sense or intuit or are biased even just toward this idea that there's more going on than these physical layers that we can see, that we can measure. We can begin to measure some of the subtle stuff when we start talking about like, electrical fields and brain waves and these things that we know are associated with living bodies or modes of consciousness, but we don't fully understand how to manipulate or fully understand what it is that they're doing. We know that when there's, electronic dysrhythmia in the heart, it's incredibly dangerous, for instance. But beyond that, it's pretty foggy. Are we talking about subtle bodies? Are we talking about auras? Are we talking about what the ancients would have called soul vehicles, to tease that? And some people might be surprised to find out that these ideas are not just new age, they're not just, Eastern. There's a whole Western tradition
Yeah,
of these ideas of subtle bodies. And
yeah.
I loved that episode you did on that topic. So if you wouldn't mind riffing on how, in this Western esoteric milieu, these ideas were thought about. Obviously, it ranges depending on what time in history we're talking about. But yeah,
Yeah.
just generally would love to hear your riff on that.
Well, I'm tempted as a historian of ideas to start from now and go back. So how did we get
Ooh,
to where we are, right? How for
yeah.
example, you said astral traveling. Like, okay, let's unpack that for a second. Astral, that implies the
Right.
stars.
Yeah.
Who thinks that a soul that leaves the body has something to do with the stars, right? And I
Hmm.
think, though I haven't researched this in depth, I think you can trace that idea back to roughly Theosophy, the Theosophical Society, when you had precisely people who were very, very interested in all manner of ideas from esoteric Buddhism and the Indian subcontinent, right? They were reading a lot of stuff, mostly translated into European languages. They were really into that stuff. But you had a very powerful movement within Theosophy, especially based around London, people like G.R.S. Mead, um,
Hmm.
A.E. Waite, various folks like that, who were going hard for the Western tradition. Like, we don't need to go to India for this stuff. We already have it. And they found, lo and behold, the works of Plato and the later Platonists, in which we have a subtle body that our soul acquires when descending into the physical body, and we actually have multiple such subtle bodies in the usual account or in the late antique account, by which time things have become very like kind of detailed. So in authors like Macrobius, who's easily accessible in Latin to Latin readers, which is like everyone who went to an English public school in the 19th century, um, or more recondite authors like Proclus and Plotinus, who you had to know Greek really well because a lot of their stuff wasn't in
Yeah.
English in the late 19th, early 20th century. You find specifically this bodies that are sort of accreted onto the soul at each
Hmm.
stellar level. So they are astral bodies, quite literally, right? They're because we have to think back into a geocentric cosmos, which is the sort of default Hellenistic Greco-Roman world model after a certain point. It's the one that the Platonists all accept because seemingly it's the one that Plato adumbrates in the Timaeus myth, right?
Yeah.
So you're in a geocentric cosmos. The Earth is at the center, but of course that means it's furthest away from God in a certain sense. And as we descend from a more divine place to this less divine place, we travel through these nested spheres, which are the planetary spheres and the sphere of the fixed stars. And we acquire pneumata along the way. Often at each sphere, often the spheres will, as in Macrobius, who makes this explicit, each sphere will give you a pneuma body that has the corresponding astrological attribute, right? So when you go through the sphere of Mars, you're gonna be given like irascibility, and when you go through the sphere of Venus, you're gonna be given something to do with like creative love, eros, generation, and so on and so forth, right? So that's where astral body comes from. Now, I think you could probably do a much more detailed and much more interesting tracing of how the idea of astral body gets to modern, let's call it a culture, new age world, where it's just thrown around as though it doesn't have a history.
Right.
And we might even think of it as a modern new age idea, right? The astral body. But I think it has, and I'm willing to put some money on the kind of theosophical and theosophical adjacent origin story for this notion in English, that they were reading Platonists, some Hermetica, and going, it's an astral body.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, G.R.S. Mead even translate. I mean, a lot of, he was clearly very obsessed with the Hermetica in a way that is, let's just say, not as scholarly. And like clearly, you could tell he was into it. Like when you read G.R.S. Mead, it's like he was a practitioner of this stuff and was very much trying to use this. I don't know if there's a hermetic method necessarily, but he was buying the metaphysical territory to some degree. And I mean, in terms of contemporary thinkers who were evoking this stuff too, one of the things that has been of continuous interest to me since I read it in the Red Book is Philemon, Jung's sort of wise man archetype, Senex figure, giving this speech to the dead where he is evoking all of these Platonic and Gnostic metaphysical ideas. Like he specifically says, he talks about this idea of the principium individuationis, which becomes individuation, Jung's famous concept of individuation, which, to be honest, I'm embarrassed to admit, when I was reading Shaw's book, Theurgy and the Soul, and he started talking about the principle of individuation and Aristotle, I didn't actually understand that this was not just a Jungian idea, that idea goes back way, way further under a different context in Western.
Maybe.
Okay.
I think Shaw might be reading it back. And I'm not saying in an illegitimate way, but in a way that other thinkers might not find in the sources.
I see. Okay.
I haven't seen anything in Iamblichus, that's for damn sure, or in Aristotle really, that I would want to overlay with the Jungian notion of individuation.
I don't think it. Sorry, just to clarify, I think he's just talking about it more in the sense of like how is it that an individual thing becomes an individual thing?
Yes,
and that is like a whole trope, right?
That is a big thing. Yes, what is the ousia? What is the essence of an existing individual thing? That is a question that Plato is deeply invested in. Aristotle is also deeply invested in, and one could argue that from the disagreements and agreements of the two thinkers on that subject, the whole medieval and then modern status questionis arises. There's many other people who are interested in this question, like the Stoics and the Epicureans and the skeptics and all kinds of ancient folks who but it's Plato and Aristotle fundamentally who kind of make it out of antiquity at least half alive, at least limping in popular discourse, so that when the debates continue through the Middle Ages, it's those guys that people are really, it's their ideas that are setting the debate. So in that sense, yes, individuation for sure. This is also discussed by historians of philosophy, I think, in terms of the question of universals and particulars,
Mm-hmm.
um, which is very much a kind of second order category that historians of philosophy have come up with, which is a little bit above my pay grade because I'm not in that world per se. But I think even to modern logicians and mathematical log- thinkers, it remains a going problem.
Yeah.
It's not
Yeah.
a answered thing. It's a
Right.
thing that still presents a lot of problems, a lot of paradoxes to our thinking.
Totally. Yeah, I was talking to Richard Tarnas about this a lot when we were riffing this notion that really we're in the era now of, we know that universals, archetypes, that's the way people used to think about reality, but now we know stuff is made of little bits that grow from the bottom up and get increasingly complex until they become, distinct creatures, and then, you know, blah 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 blah, eventually we get humans and human consciousness, and that's clearly not the case. To your point, like, y- there are strong reasons to, I think, are continue to argue for universals and archetypes being an actual reality, like an actual ontological reality. But back to Jung, back to this example from the Red Book, um, and this fits in with a conversation about archetypes as well, I guess. He specifically brings up this idea that either you sort of fail in your quest to individuate, um, live out the plan of your fate, your daimon, etc., or you become immortal as a star. And as you well know, that might sound so first of all, that kind of might sound strange and out of nowhere to people that haven't gone a little bit deeper into the Western esoteric tradition, deeper into Platonism, deeper into hermeticism, Gnosticism. But it continues to illustrate this point that there is this celestial element to the human individual. And
Yeah.
it goes way, way back, at least to the Timaeus. I mean, I don't know if you know of any associations between uh, human souls and stars before the Timaeus, but there's a famous passage in the Timaeus that talks about when the craftsman, the demiurge, creates the souls, that there's a corresponding star essentially to each soul.
Yep. It does go arguably further, but it gets murkier
Hmm.
the further back you go.
Yes.
I wonder, if we want to look at Jung's formulation there.
Yeah,
I mean, he's probably referencing the Timaeus, but
for
he could
sure.
just as easily, depending on when he said that. I'm assuming this is sort of the later Jung. He could just be quoting
Well,
Aleister Crowley, for all we know, who
well,
says every man and
actually
woman is
not
a star.
right. And yeah, that's another good, important, obviously very important example to the whole Western esoteric tradition. But the Red Book is actually, I mean, he wrote, I think it's like 19. I'm supposed to be a Jung head, and I'm forgetting what years he was writing the Red Book, but it's actually fairly early.
Right.
It doesn't come to light until like 2009 or something.
Yeah.
But he wrote this after his falling out with Freud, and this was like this might be like 1918 or
Right.
1915 or
Yeah.
something like that. Um, so he was, I mean, he was definitely, and he was definitely aware of the Timaeus. I know he mentions the Timaeus several times in his collected works. He talks about the Timaeus with Wolfgang Pauli when they're rapping about synchronicity, and they're trying to figure out this sort of, strange uh, correspondence kind of thing that must be going on to allow synchronicities to manifest. But anyway,
Hmm.
back to the track. If in case people have lost it at this point, this track of the human being, at least in the Western esoteric tradition, is not just this fleshy, thing that grew from the ground up. It is this thing with layers, with subtle layers. And
Hmm.
some of these layers seemingly correspond to the stars, to to
Yeah,
astral bodies, to planets, to its own star, I guess. And reading Shaw's book, also, I came across the Greek term for this body for the first time. Is it ogoides soma? Is that how you say it? Ogoides
that's
soma?
one term. There's a whole range of
Okay.
terms that different authors use to talk about this thing. Yeah, the algoides soma is one. Um, pneumatikon soma, like the pneuma body, is another one. Sometimes they call it the garment. Proclus talks about
Hmm.
chitones, which is like, um, well, it's like a shirt. It's like a tunic. They're like tunics that we don when we descend into the world. Um, and sometimes they call it the psyches ochima, the vehicle of the soul. Right. So there's a whole range of vocabulary. Often scholarship will collapse all of those terms into one thing. Usually the vehicle being
Yeah.
the popular one, and just assume that all of these different references to subtle bodies are referring to the same thing. And I don't think that's right. I think if we want to talk about ancient Greek subtle body belief very kind of generally, you can legitimately do that. But if we want to get into the individual beliefs of authors who are often very technical and very detailed and have posit multiple bodies that do different things, and do they survive death, do they not survive death, are they astral, are they not astral, all that kind of stuff gets brought up, then you got to be way more specific. But
Yeah.
algoides
Yeah.
soma is definitely Jamblichus's favorite term for it, if
Okay.
I remember right, which is something
Okay.
like light body, actually,
Hmm.
illuminated
Interesting.
body.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is, at least in the passage that I remember highlighting, is associated with the spherical, I don't know, reality of the soul. That this
Yeah.
is the thing that is like this spherical light that is actually the soul. And I think it was probably being talked
Well,
about under the context of preparing it for um a theurgic ritual, or to just the general importance of purifying this thing if
yeah,
you're going to be trying to work with it.
exactly. The subtle body is stuck to your soul, and because for a late Platonist, this is the important thing to remember. For earlier Platonists, soul is technically immaterial; it's
Mm,
incorporeal, but it kind of can be described quite loosely as something that flies around outside the body, like Plutarch in his eschatological myths. He talks about the
yeah.
souls flying up and down, and you can kind of see them. And same in the Hermetica. The Hermetica treat souls, you might say, in a kind of naive way, as like sort of like Doctor Strange, when Doctor Strange sends out his astral form, and it's this sort of like ghost version of Doctor Strange,
Hmm.
that he
Hmm.
just didn't bother to color in. Uh, for the later Platonists like Plotinus and Iamblichus, they go really hard on the incorporeality of the soul. The soul is not in a place. Soul does not. You cannot touch soul. Soul cannot be touched. Soul is apathes. It's um, what's the word? Not subject to any change from outside. I can't remember
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
standard English translation. So
Yeah.
if stuff happens to you, to your soul, it's because it's happening to your subtle body, which is kind of like the glue between your soul and your gross body. So the subtle body, or bodies, are somewhere between a regular body and the soul in terms of materiality,
Yeah.
and they can become impurified. They can get kind of gross accretions, and so doing immoral things, obsessing about bodily pleasures, um, all that kind of stuff is going to make your body heavy and moist, and what you want it to be like is more like fiery and light and mobile, and that's going to let you leave the earth and go up.
Yeah. Yeah, there's this general idea that if you're into worldly stuff, you're going to get held down. If you're
Hmm.
constantly, if you have a clean diet and you live a philosophically pure, virtuous life, and your gaze is oriented upward, for lack of a better term, that's going to give you a cleaner, lighter soul. And
A
a question
cleaner, lighter
actually,
soul body, though.
Yeah, right.
not the soul. The soul is already clean. That's what I'm saying. It's the
I
body.
got
For
you.
the later Platonists, is the body that can be purified or defiled. The soul cannot be defiled by anything in this cosmos.
Yeah. And Socrates says this too, right? Like the soul, like there's essentially nothing you can do to damage the soul. I don't remember is that
Mhm.
in Phaedo? I'm guessing.
Yeah, there is that in Phaedo. Well, yeah, he's not talking in the same register, but he does. I mean, you certainly can't kill it. That's for sure. You
Right.
can kill the body, but you can't kill the soul in the Phaedo. Um, and but Socrates, who, as far as we know, had no idea about subtle bodies. This is all like later speculation, right? People filling in the
Well,
kind of
don't you
technical side of things.
don't I totally sympathize with this idea that from a scholarly standpoint,
Yeah.
there's nothing clear evidence that Socrates talked about this, but don't you? I mean, there are mentions of Yatramontes in Platonic dialogues.
Yes,
So,
but I don't think
so
the
wouldn't you
Yatramontes
think
they
that?
have.
Okay.
I don't think they have an idea of soul body either. What I'm saying is, I think
Hmm.
earlier notions of soul, um, that like we find in the Pythagoreans, Plato, they don't seem to have gone into the technical detail of working out what a truly incorporeal um, entity that cannot be in any way, shape, or form influenced by the cosmic reality would
Hmm.
entail. So in the Phaedo and the Phaedrus, both Platonic
Yeah.
dialogues, he basically just says the soul can get corrupted by following its appetites or being obsessed with bodily pleasures or the sensory world. Um,
Hmm.
Later Platonists would have just said, well, what he meant, of course, was the subtle body because the soul
Yeah.
itself is incorruptible. So it's like kind of a technical point. But he, yeah, one of the things the later tradition does to try to iron out all of Plato into a single body of dogmatic teaching is add little entities that Plato doesn't specifically reference and be like, well, this is what he's really talking about, you
Hmm.
know.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
he does refer to the ochema
Right.
in the Timaeus. So in a couple different contexts, so that they're like, this is Plato speaking esoterically about this thing that we call the soul vehicle, and
Yeah.
we are going to apply that to the Platonic teachings as a whole, even though it's just kind of an offhand reference in the Timaeus, if that makes sense.
Well, oh, it makes sense. Yeah, it totally makes sense. And can we do a little irresponsible late Platonist, so late, like right now, Platonist
Okay, yeah,
speculation on
yeah,
on I'm I, the non-scholar, the one who does not need to be responsible in any way, shape, or form, am throwing this idea out here. So, I mean, you might even just know this as soon as I just give you the citation, but 109E in the Phaedo, Socrates is talking about this whole situation that, for people that don't know this, that don't immediately go, oh yeah, he's talking about this, the true earth and all this stuff. Um, so he's about to die.
yeah,
He's riffing on the nature of the soul, what this life is. And then he goes into this whole interesting speech about how this earth that we perceive is not the true earth. And then
mm,
he goes on this whole riff about, that the earth, if really what we see is akin to like a crustacean on the bottom of the ocean, looking up through the ocean at the
yeah,
stars.
yeah,
But then he says something interesting, and if I didn't read this under the context of being currently interested in this stuff, and I told you I'm working on this whole video that plays with this idea a lot, I'll just read the quote. He says, "We're unable to attain the upper surface of the air, for if anyone should come to the top of the air or should get wings and fly up, he would lift his head above it and see, as fishes lift their heads out of the water and see the things in our world. So he would see things in that upper world. And if his nature were strong enough to bear the sight, he would recognize that this is the real heaven." I mean,
mm,
it, I mean, that if he could, I don't know, if he could get wings and fly up it almost makes you think of this um this I mean it makes me think of this idea almost directly. Like if you could somehow, separate from your physical nature
Yeah.
and you could peek out into the greater reality, the intelligible, the nous, you would see that there's a lot more going on here and things are far, and he goes on to talk about how much more beautiful it is and how much more
Yeah.
um um and also, I mean, he establishes some additional interesting context, like the purer realm is a bunch of not physical entities hanging out. So it almost sounds like, hey, if you could be a non-physical entity and peek out there, you'd see the same thing.
Yeah. He also, just for the record, says that the true Earth is a giant multicolored dodecahedron,
Yeah,
which is pretty
yeah,
fresh.
it is fresh. It's very fresh. And I did want to ask you. I mean, this is we're getting like kind of off topic of what um, I wanted to riff with you about, but I would love to hear what your thoughts are on that, if anything. I've heard some
Well,
interesting.
the dodecahedron is really interesting vis-a-vis Plato, because we have these five solids called the platonic solids. And why are they called the platonic solids? Because Plato in the Timaeus, or actually the character Timaeus, talks about the four elements being made up of these solids. So Plato somehow, or Timaeus is somehow positing a geometric atomism, that everything, all the particulars of the universe are made up of fundamentally mathematical objects,
Mhm.
which it turns out might be right, but that's another story. And he gives us four. Now, just from a geometric perspective, the platonic solids are the only five solids that can be constructed geometrically such that, let me see if I get this right, all the faces are the same, all the vertices are the same viewed from any direction, and um, I think that's enough to define the platonic solids. There's only five of those. One is the cube, one is the octahedron, which is like a D&D die that people are familiar with, a triangular face. The dodecahedron, the icosahedron, which is triangular faces but 20 sides, and uh, the one I've missed out, the four-sided tetrahedron, which is just four
Yeah.
triangles whacked together.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, all of them have either square sides or triangular sides. And of course, the square-sided one can be divided into two triangles, two right triangles, right? Except the dodecahedron, the 12-sided one, which has pentagonal faces. And in the
Yeah.
Timaeus account, he says, so we've got these four, elements: earth, air, fire, water. And there's a fifth one of these solids, which the creator used in the construction of the heaven as a whole. Anyway, let's move on. So he's doing
Right.
a typical piece of, Socratic or Platonic suggestive esotericism. Like, there is this other shape. We're not going to tell you what it is. So you at least have to work it out for yourself. If I'm not just flagging its esoteric significance, but he doesn't name it in the Timaeus. However, in the True Earth passage of the Phaedo that you were talking about, he does specifically name the 12-sided figure. Each side
Yeah.
is brilliantly colored. They're all different colors. It's this crazy psychedelic dodecahedron. Uh, I don't know what I make of it more than that, except that Plato is really interested in geometry. He clearly sees, or at least is very interested in, the question of whether or not the fact that the visible universe seems to be geometrical in some sense, or mathematical in some sense, right?
Yeah.
Which is an idea that continues to perplex scientists. Like, why should the universe be so intelligible mathematically? That
Right.
doesn't make sense. It's the unreasonable intelligibility of the universe, unless it is itself mathematical in some way. Um, he's interested in that. He's interested in investigating what can be investigated in those terms in his day, which is things like the platonic solids. Um, and he thinks the 12-sided one, the dodecahedron, is especially significant. Now,
Yeah.
the dodecahedron is a very interesting shape. One thing you get with fivefold geometry that you don't get with the other shapes is that fivefold geometry automatically generates the so-called golden section. So every way you divide up
Ah.
if you inscribe a pentagram inside a pentagon, so a 5-pointed star. Whether because you are investigating geometry or because you are a big fan of Slayer or whatever the case may be, when you draw your pentagram, which incidentally the ancient sources tell us is a symbol of the Pythagoreans, uh, if you take the different parts of the 5-pointed star that you've inscribed and relate them to each other, it's always in perfect golden section phi ratios. So 5.5-fold geometry generates the phi ratio. And the phi ratio we have reason to think is significant to Plato. But what are we going to make of it? I don't know. I just throw that stuff out there. It's there's Plato's clearly putting a puzzle in front of us on purpose. It's also clear from what survives from antiquity that it was baffling to the ancients, right? It's not just that we're baffled by it, but if we just take the time to read our ancient sources, we'll figure it out, because Theon of Smyrna's book on mathematics useful for reading Plato survives, and it's
cool.
He goes, well, the dodecahedron is this shape, but I don't know what to make of it. You know? Same with Proclus, same with Iamblichus. They have lots of speculations into the number stuff, but they don't seem to really know what Plato was on about.
Interesting.
Yeah,
I've seen some. Oh God, I wish I could remember it better, but it was a really long time ago. I've seen some sacred geometry discussion about the relationship between the sphere and the dodecahedron, and unfortunately, I cannot remember anything more than that. But we know that Socrates knew that the Earth was sphere. I mean, right in this same section, he says, "Well, first of all, the Earth is a sphere in the heavens, suspended by nothing," which is like, wow, that's pretty good. Like, it's pretty good for your time in history. How he knew that, I don't know.
Oh, the sphericalness, or the roughly sphericalness of the Earth was Socrates in one place actually refers to two options. There's some people think it's flat and some people think it's round, but the Greeks very quickly, they've obviously in the 5th century are thinking about a spherical Earth, and it did not take them at all long to prove mathematically, geometrically that the thing is spherical. It's provable through like things like measuring the shadows cast by sticks and stuff like that. It's not that difficult to prove. And the flat Earth simply dies out. In about the 5th century.
And the suspended. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. I was going to say the suspended by nothing part is pretty key as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Later, sometime in the 3rd century, I believe, we actually see coming out of Alexandria, people reasoning from these sort of first tentatives that people like Plato, Eudoxus of Cnidos, Aristotle were making about the Earth and its relation to the other things we see in the sky. And you get a heliocentric cosmic model, which is basically a super rough outline of a modern solar system. But that didn't take. So the spherical Earth took, and there's literally no educated person in the Western world who thinks the Earth is flat until the 21st century. But I mean, there's some uneducated people. There's some like dumbass monks and stuff who think the Earth is flat because the Bible says so. But it's mostly, not a going concern. But geocentrism somehow, for whatever reason, and maybe the prestige of the Timaeus and of Aristotle has to do with this, that just gets stuck, and people stay with geocentrism going forward.
Yeah. But I mean, it's foggy, but I know some Neoplatonists at least were heliocentrists, right?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, their commitment to the noetic sun, they're heliocentrists in the sense that they think the sun is far more honorable than the Earth. The Earth is, sometimes people misinterpret the ancient geocentric cosmos as being a kind of, aren't we great? We humans were at the center of the cosmos, but it's quite the opposite. It's aren't we rather lowly, we humans stuck here in the sewer of the cosmos, furthest away from the imperishable stars, furthest away from God. We're in like the shittest part of reality. So it's not an arrogant like, haha, we humans are great, look at us in the center. It's quite the opposite. I don't know of any heliocentric Platonists. I would love to know about that. I know that Proclus discusses a lot of going concerns in astronomy in his day, in his commentary on his hypotypesis, like whatever it is, like his discussion of astronomical positions, which like no one has read since it was edited in the 19th century, and I certainly haven't read it. But he looks at all different theories, and some people have argued that Proclus's take on Plato, the sort of standard Platonic. This is getting way into the weeds. Your viewers and listeners are probably switching off now, but it has been argued that Proclus doesn't think the universe is really a geocentric set of nested spheres, but rather that this is a convenient mathematical model to think with, and that he may actually think the real state of affairs is very different. But I've never read anyone saying he thinks it's a heliocentric solar system.
Interesting. Okay. So the reason I said that is because in doing research for the thing that I'm currently working on, and I'm just giving random examples of people who are clearly inspired, that are foundational to Western science, that are clearly inspired by today what we would call esoteric things. And in some, God, I can't even remember what book I was quoting now, but in something that I cite in the script of the video, Copernicus's potential Neoplatonic influence is cited as part of his motivation for investigating heliocentrism.
For shizzle.
But it doesn't go into where and why that heliocentric influence would come from.
Well, it's you can be more specific than that. He published his findings as the ancient Pythagorean cosmology redux, not Platonist, but Pythagorean, because there was a Pythagorean called Philolaos, who's probably the only early Pythagorean that we actually have any real fragments of, who lived. He was an older contemporary of Plato himself.
Could he be Timaeus?
Well, Timaeus might have actually been Timaeus. I mean, there might have. Scholars don't agree with this, but this will be of interest to your listeners. So let's just do a little sidetrack here, and then we'll get back to the Pythagorean cosmology of Philolaus. Every single interlocutor in Plato's dialogues, except for two, is identifiable as a historical person, and so everyone agrees that like all these different people you find in the dialogues are real people that Plato's just putting words in their mouth, right? The two exceptions are Timaeus and Diotima of Mantinea, who delivers the mysteries of Eros in the Symposium. Now, why do we think these were made up by Plato? Right. We don't have independent. I mean, we do. We have a book by Timaeus of Locri, but it's almost certainly a forgery, a Hellenistic forgery. Someone writing the book that Timaeus, Plato's character, would have written, right? Not actually a book by a guy called Timaeus of Locri, we think. But, I mean, why did Plato totally break the mold and invent two characters from whole cloth while everyone else in the books are real people? You tell me. So some people will tell you, I think Diotima totally was real. I think Timaeus was real. Maybe, who knows? But the consensus would be that they weren't real, that Plato made them up. Now, Philolaos didn't have exactly a heliocentric cosmology, but had, as far as we can reconstruct it, a cosmology whereby the Earth and the other planets are circling around something called the hearth, the central fire, including the sun. The sun is also circling around the central fire. And there's a really cool thing called the counter-Earth, the antichthon, which is on the exact other side of the central fire that we can never see it, but it must be there, possibly so that heavenly bodies all add up to 10, which is a number that Pythagoreans really like. I think that's what Aristotle
Yeah.
says. He's like they have no reason to posit this antithon. They just want to get a 10 out of it. I think it's Aristotle who says that. But anyway, that was enough for Copernicus in going through all these old, sort of fragmentary texts to say, okay, the ancient Pythagoreans were on the track of heliocentrism. Also, we know that Hellenistic astronomers just did come up with a heliocentric notion, like just much more with forget about the number 10. Let's just look at how things actually move and try to model it. And so he presented his work in that light. Copernicus, I can't remember what the actual sort of title page of his book as it was printed is, but it definitely mentions the ancient Pythagoreans on the title page.
Okay.
So it's
That's
not
cool.
late Platonists, it's Pythagoreans. It's when you jumping ahead a little bit, when we get to Kepler, that's where things get really esoteric and really modern science-y, for lack of a better term, because he figures out Kepler's laws of planetary motion, which turn out to be spot on. He breaks free from this constraint of thinking everything has to move in perfect circles because that's the most perfect shape, right? He's like, no, they move in ellipses. That's fine. Ellipses or hyperbolas. I can't remember which one. I think it's ellipses. But if I got that wrong, geometry people, I apologize. And astronomers. But he's doing all of this from a place of modeling the celestial movements in terms of nested platonic solids that he's getting from an esoteric exegesis of the Timaeus, informed by reading Proclus, like deeply reading Proclus. So
Amazing.
Kepler is an example of that, that kind of Francis Yates paradigm of an early modern thinker going into the esoteric traditions and coming up with like the real goods in terms of modern science.
Yeah. Yates is one of those writers I hear brought up all the time, and I'm like, oh yeah, I gotta read Francis Yates, and I haven't, but I think I was gonna say I don't know how we get this back to the original through line we were exploring of subtle, but I do actually have a way to kind of 180 back into that, because so we read the Timaeus fairly recently for my patron book club, and I kind of warned people ahead of time, like, this is not going to be a casual read. Like, this is going to be challenging. You're going to have to look up supplementary material. I definitely told everyone to listen to your episode on the Timaeus.
That's
and
kind.
Of course, yeah. I mean,
did you read
every chance I get?
Did you read the Atlantis myth as well? You didn't just do the creation. Okay, good.
Yeah. So one of the things that just, continuously strikes me about the sophistication, it's not just the sophistication of these thinkers. It's they'll sometimes say things that are so spot on that it's just how in the fuck did you know this? And that brings me back to, could there be some method of knowledge acquisition that today we have no idea about, or at the very least we dismiss as just completely woo-woo fairy tales,
right?
But that you've got to, I mean, not to just go completely ancient civilization Graham Hancocky out of nowhere, but like, clearly there are these overlaps in ancient civilizations, their obsession with the stars, their deep commitment to building these astrologically aligned megalithic structures, and just all of this stuff that, like, we've lost so much of the wet work, that was done underneath the surface of these borderline immortal structures. And perhaps part of this method were knowledge acquisition techniques like soul flight, like entering altered states of consciousness where it really did seem like you were communing with something else infinitely wiser than you. And we don't even fully have to speculate on this, because there are many accounts of this kind of thing. Parmenides' account of his, and traveling in what, a vehicle, a chariot,
Yeah.
to encounter a goddess who then goes on to tell him the truth about reality, and her whole
Hmm.
monistic rap about how nothing has ever been created, everything is perfect and continuous and one, and things only appear to be disparate and diverse and finite.
Well, there's a lot you could say about that. If to kind of, well, to agree with you, um, yes, uh, we have, for example, with the Pythagoreans or with Empedocles or Parmenides. These are these sort of pre-Plato type philosophers.
Yeah.
We have every reason to think that they were habitually engaging in um, communing with non-human persons to gain knowledge, right? And this is uh, just a standard thing in ancient culture, by which I mean Greco-Roman culture. This shouldn't surprise us. It was, for some people, it was a daily occurrence. Even if it didn't happen during waking time, it would at least happen in dreams,
Right.
So nothing surprising there. Now, what kind of knowledge were they gaining? Well, here's the thing. If we want to be take it, let's for the sake of argument take a realist approach to the non-human person encounters that these guys are having.
Sure.
It's clear that these and just go in whole, like, yes, Parmenides met a goddess. Yes, Socrates had a daimonion that would like save his ass when he was about to do something wrong, and it would like pull, don't do it, Socrates, and he would stop, and then like he'd avoid the car crash or whatever, this sort of thing. That's all literally true. We still have the problem, it seems to me, that while they were getting all kinds of crazy, interesting cosmological ideas from these encounters, they weren't coming up with Kepler's laws of planetary motion, nor were they coming up with anything even remotely as sophisticated as modern cosmology, which is based not only on tools like telescopes and like increased savvy in making instruments, but also based on cumulative application of scientific method and observation over hundreds of years. So they got some stuff right and they got some stuff wrong, in other words. So these entities they're talking to are they're not hip to modern science, even though they're goddesses and whatnot, or they don't primarily exist to transmit that kind of knowledge. They're trying to tell you other types of truth. But that has the corollary that they can't, you can't just plug into these sacred ways of knowing and figure out the truth about reality, assuming that the truth about reality is that, let's say, modern cosmology is at least less wrong than ancient cosmology, which makes sense to me, or that there's some kind of interaction going on between the encounter with the non-human persons and the cultural background and imagination and individual psyche of the person doing the encounter, such that they're going to speak a language you can understand in your cultural valence, what you know. So they simply can't just blow your mind with the knowledge of the future or whatever, because you just won't get it. You don't have the language for it, right?
Right.
Yeah. And that you could also extend that model, it seems to me, to notions of the imaginal, which is a term popularized, sort of coined and popularized by Henri Corbin, which has since exploded outwards from Corbin and the Ernos world into general kind of a culture, metaphysical ways of speaking nowadays. People misuse the term all the time, or at least use it in a way that Corbin didn't mean. But this is a kind of autonomous place that is real, where you can encounter, if you're a Muslim, prophets and angelic beings and stuff, often in dreams, but often in visions, and you're really encountering prophets and angelic beings. However, it's also abundantly clear that everyone who encounters has experiences in the imaginal world does so in a way that's kind of suited to their temperament, right? They do it in their own kind of language. So it's true in some way, according to this way of thinking, but it's not the kind of objective truth whereby if I write a mathematical proof and send it to you and you check it and you're like, yes,
Mm-hmm.
it adds up, and it's always going to add up, and we send it to all our colleagues and they all agree, yep, it's still the same, it's still mathematically true, there's no ambiguity.
Yeah.
It's not that kind of truth you're encountering in the imaginal world, right?
Right. Right. Well, check this out. While you were talking about this, I was thinking about an even more meta perspective on Parmenides' vision, because implicit in what the goddess would be saying then, right, is I'm not real. If everything is one and continuous and immortal, on some more fundamental level, you're not real, but neither am I, because everything is really one. So,
Yeah.
what Parmenides is really interacting with is another manifestation of the one
Yeah.
that is wearing, and this is very James Hillman now, of like, dream in the underworld. Like, this is the imaginal or consciousness or whatever, or an archetype wearing a mask that you can interact with. And, in a Hillman or Jungian sense, this mask might be maybe you would be a mask in a dream I would have where someone's teaching me something, right? Like I encounter
Hmm.
like, oh, this is like a teacher I really like, and he's going to give me this lesson now. Well, you weren't there, but something was there giving me this information. And of course, we can have conversations about, is this my unconscious mind? What is the unconscious mind, collective unconscious, mundus imaginalis, whatever. But whatever it is, it's something that you can understand and you can interact with. And I got to a level in this conversation, a very similar conversation with Jeff Kripal,
Yeah.
where he was telling me, I believe the phenomenon, but I don't believe in the image, essentially. And what he means by that is, I do believe near death experiences, visionary experiences, UFO experiences are representative of something really happening. But
Hmm.
whatever the image that's presenting to the experiencer, that I don't take literally.
Right. Yeah.
And then this gets into this next question of, then what is presenting the image and what is manifesting the image? And I think, to your point, it's got to be the cultural zeitgeist, or you know kind of Jung's idea about collective consciousnesses or shadows of nations, communities, tribes,
Yeah.
that everybody, because otherwise, what is it? Is it the daimon responsible for, like, let's show him this image because he won't understand that image? Or is it the just the mind editorializing the mysterium tremendum after the fact? It's like, I mean, in my own case, speaking of shamans having wars, like astral wars with one another, I've been to Peru and drank ayahuasca, and let me tell you, you definitely go through some kind of just fractal washing machine of just like visions and images and impossible to communicate things. But
Hmm.
then occasionally it's punctuated by incredibly well formed visions where it does feel like I'm literally here with a being that is telling me something.
Right.
So it's like a mixture of all this stuff. And then of course there is the same thing that happens when you have a dream, right? It eventually becomes not the dream but the story of the dream. And yeah, I mean, all of this stuff gets muddled up together. Um but I've been blabbering for too long, and I'm sure
Not at
that has
all.
evoked
So
a riff in you.
what's interesting or maybe relevant here is that, like, my understanding of the folks who take ayahuasca, or who've been taking ayahuasca for a long ass time before it became the trendy drug of the early 2020s, which I think is how it will be remembered in a certain cultural context. Um, I think this is like the ayahuasca moment, in the same way like the 70s was the cocaine moment, and the 90s sort of was like a ketamine moment for a lot of people, I think, and so on, as LSD in the 60s. I think now seems to be the ayahuasca moment in certain aspects of our culture. Um, the folks who've been taking it forever, they tend to see their ancestors, right?
Right.
And
Mhm.
like granddad. And people who come from America and Europe and wherever who take ayahuasca don't tend to see their ancestors. So this might be an example of that. What your culture kind of programs you to expect to see is going to be partly what you see when the usual rules of how your mind works are radically altered temporarily.
Mm-hmm. But I do, this question of what is presenting itself, like
Right.
when we're in an altered state of consciousness or perception via whatever means,
Mm-hmm.
to me, it's hard not to start thinking about ideas like, I mean, this is going a little bit off track here, but one of the ideas I spent some time trying to grok to some degree is, I did this video on Plato's cave where I tried to go deeper than any of the stuff that you're going to find in like a 15-minute YouTube video.
Mm-hmm.
And I borrowed some inspiration from you, but I also read some other papers and tried to some degree, understand Proclus's commentary on this. And one of the ideas that he talks about is, being able to get to a point where you are encountering an intermediate form, or you are having downloading some wisdom from the logoi of your soul that is like
Mm-hmm.
shining down into this dimension. But regardless of if you are able to do that or not, you're still kind of like crustacean POV that we were talking
Right.
about before in the Phaedo. Like you're encountering something greater than this physical world, and you're trying to funnel it down into whatever you can hold as a
Yeah.
very limited vessel. And I kind of that's sort of my explanation for this whole riff that we were talking about earlier of like, well, if you really are encountering like a hyper cosmic goddess, why can't she just, matrix uh differential calculus right into your brain
Yeah.
instantaneously,
Yeah.
like, Neo style? And I think that would be my stab at a guess, is that you are in this physical instantiation limited in what you can bring back from these places, because I mean they're filled with sacred geometry, they're filled with platonic, interconnected nested platonic solids that are just like in you. I mean, it's not even just
Yeah.
like I'm seeing it, I'm having a hallucination of it. It's like, oh, I'm made of this. I'm
Yeah.
made of moving, flowing geometry over my hands. And if I'm on a sufficient dose, it's emanating off of my cat. It's like it's everywhere. But how do I bring that back into uh, I bring it back into my language. I bring it back into my intellectual tool set and only the psychotechnologies I have at my disposal. And maybe that is a slow, linear process here, but it really already exists in totality
Right.
somewhere.
Mm.
Whether we're talking about the goddesses monism or we're talking about like the block universe, right? Like the idea that time is an illusion from a theoretical, even not even theoretical physics. Sorry, this is relativity. Just
Yeah.
time's really an illusion
Well,
of
it's not. It's
where
not an
we are.
It's time as we tend to see it as this kind of unicursal flow in one direction is not the actual state of
Yes.
affairs. I think that's kind of uncontroversial to say.
Yeah.
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 So here's a question for you. You're naturally modern, like hip people who've done lots of psychedelics and are really interested in consciousness and have read some Jung and have watched The Matrix.
Mhm.
We tend to reach for a certain bag of metaphors. Oh, and take UFO encounter literature into account, and the whole study of the paranormal and all that sort of thing. And are familiar with the more hip, the less boneheaded approaches to trying to make sense of these very real experiences people have, like Jeff Kripal's and others.
Mhm.
We reach for a certain bag of metaphors. Like we tend to go say things like download and
Mm-hmm.
matrix and stuff like this in talking about this stuff. But what I wonder is whether, because the ancients that we're reading, and I'm specifically talking about the ancient Greeks here because they're the ones I've read the most of, and also the ones I find very interesting in this context. People like Proclus, but even more so Plotinus, who seems to have gone to some seriously heavy places in his journeyings,
Yeah.
places outside of time and space, and seems to have been able to do this almost on the daily as his normal state of affairs. Like he's sort of able to work in the everyday world with folks, but he's really in the nous all the time, or most of the time. They seem to have been achieving all of this by dint of philosophy,
Mm-hmm.
by dint of doing Platonist philosophy as a way of life. And while there is a great temptation among modern readers of this stuff who want to take it seriously as phenomenologically valid ancient Platonist philosophy, there's a strong desire to go like, so what kind of mushrooms did they have access to? What were they
Yeah.
eating? Where were the
Mm-hmm.
psychedelics and all this? We have no evidence that there was any psychedelics. And yeah, someone's going to say, oh, what about the Kufi incense from Egypt, or what about this and that? But really, the case is not very strong for that they needed psychedelics. And moreover, I would argue the fact that we think they needed psychedelics to enter these states shows a limitation of our technologies of the self. Hence, one can argue that while the ancient Platonists may have got loads of stuff wrong from a modern perspective, and it's not at all hard to make the case that, for example, their cosmology is rubbish compared to our cosmology, and so on and so forth, that it may be by believing the story they told themselves that was part
Mm-hmm.
of a technology of the self that allowed them to enter these states of consciousness more at will than we can, and other techniques using rhythm, using light, using lots of tricks of the trade,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, such that while we're tempted, so if we want to talk about cosmology, we're, I think, right to turn to modern scientific cosmology and correct the Platonists. But when we get into the question of consciousness, I don't think we have that same stance of superiority, because, in other words, when Parmenides says, I saw a goddess, and then we turn to Jung and say, okay, well, probably Jung gives us a better explanation for this because he's talking about archetypes and da. Jung has no claim, in my view, to have a better view of reality than Parmenides, because
Yeah.
Jung, for all his attempts in that direction, has not developed a psychology that is superior to many ancient approaches to psychology. Hence, it's better, I think, to talk about the goddess as being a goddess than to talk about the goddess as being an archetype, or at least no worse.
I love it. Yeah, I love everything you're saying, and it's you got to dig around the collected works, and I think get the sort of um truth underneath the image of what Jung was presenting to even understand what he was really meaning. Because when you read the Red Book, I mean, it is a visionary text. There's
Yeah,
nothing psychological about it. He's not like, he's not talking about in terms of, you know, psychological theory. He's talking
right.
about actual visions, actual things that
Yeah,
he experienced. There's even weird paranormal stuff that he experienced that um, led to him writing. So you might know this too, that he did not publish the Red Book, but he
hmm.
did publish the Seven Sermons to the Dead under the pseudonym of Basilides.
Yeah,
And what the reason he did that is not just to, obscure his identity, but I think he really felt like this is not from me. This is not from C.G. Jung. This is from somewhere else. And there's a whole paranormal story that goes along with this that came to light later, where he was having like ghost knocks at the door and hearing voices saying like, we come from Jerusalem and we are not satisfied and stuff like that. So he was compelled to write, and he just wrote this stuff down obsessively over the course of like 2 nights or something, this huge volume of text that became the seven sermons to the dead. So I think that whatever we talk about in terms of theory over the top of it, I think, and I mean, this is what like Kingsley argues too in Catafalque, like that Jung is really in this lineage as well as Parmenides and all these other people, where he really went like in the Red Book, like underworld visions. That's what it is. Like call it whatever you want, but that's what it is. It's underworld
Mm.
visions, communing with ancestors, communing with deities, whatever you want to call it. And one of the things I love that it took me a while to find, but it's in Jung's collected works, he says that archetypes are the Platonic eidos. He
Yeah.
just says that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think he may have been more open to this, but felt the pressure as a academic, psychiatrist, whatever, to kind of Trojan horse it into psychological theory. But so that's one thing. But on the note of psychedelics, I completely agree that I think that is one method, and I think it's a completely valid method for self-exploration. I mean, it's one of these things where whenever it comes up in conversation where people are like, sometimes people ask me, well, what about meditation? Can you get to the same place in meditation as psychedelics? And I'm like, I don't know, because I've not gotten there through meditation. But what I do know is that there's no guessing or, oh, maybe that was something when you take a sufficient dose of psilocybin or something. It's like you really are having these experiences. They really are a whole body, mind, soul kind of experience. They really are soaked in information that is too dense and multifaceted for us to understand. But nonetheless, inhabiting those states is incredibly all kinds of things: transformational, healing, uh, just inspiring, deeply also brings your mortality into focus, and the fact that you do exist in this just panoply of sources of vitality and life, and you know, and all of those things are so hard to feel on that palpable level in just mundane daily consciousness. You absolutely can feel that way, doing like meta meditation, or I mean, in my case, just honestly go like when I was doing the research for that Plato's Cave video, there was a little spot I would go to and I would just like sit there and think about the sun in that kind of a context.
Right.
That's a way to do it too, but it's not the same as being in that like non-conceptual, like it's not a frontal lobe space where it's like I got there through thinking super hard about it.
Mm.
It's like I'm in this, like I'm
Yeah.
swimming in the reality of these consciousnesses. um so so there's that, but I also completely agree with you that I think there could be, are, still are techniques for reaching these visionary states on the natch. And I mean, I think I haven't been to this retreat yet, this place that I'm going, but um I mean, unless everybody's full of shit, they're clearly doing it. Like they're clearly having a lot of these similar experiences through nothing but laying down and meditating with frequencies and
Yeah.
an eye mask on. And then to your point, this evokes something kind of similar to what Plotinus was describing. Like sit down, withdraw your senses from the world, like go inward via some very nebulous meditation technique that may not really be that complicated. Like maybe it really is just
Yeah.
devoting yourself to sitting your ass on the ground in the dark for long enough.
Yeah. Well, Plotinus tells us over and over that it's simple. That's it, kind of his whole point. It's simple. It's not complex. It's simple. Um, yeah. No, these techniques exist. These traditions exist. Um, they are, the idea of can meditation take you to the same place as the psychedelics? Well, do the different psychedelics take you to the same place? I don't think so. I don't think acid takes you to the same place as ayahuasca. It takes you to the same place as iboga. There's if these are places you go to, they're all slightly different. And I think the same is probably true of different meditation traditions and techniques of cultivating the altered states through consciousness itself without external aids, or at least without psychoactive chemicals. But so they might. I wouldn't make any claims about what's the same place and what's a different place, but you can certainly get to let's say equally psychedelic places with meditation techniques, as with the drugs. But again, a lot of it has to do with the cultural context. Like, I don't think, in other words, you know how they have nowadays mindfulness meditation as a kind of denatured Buddhist technique. So they've taken some techniques from some bits of Buddhism and just forget the Buddhism, forget the whole worldview, just do the techniques and you will have results. And people do. So they have what medical science can sort of do questionnaires and say this has a positive outcome. People report that they are more content and less anxiety ridden and have better sleep and all these sorts of things, which are of course great and desirable. But I think that probably when the Buddhist tradition talks about attaining to states of realization in this ultra profound way that is not really expressible through words, they're probably onto something a little more interesting than decreasing their anxiety and having a spring in their step when they get out of bed in the morning. And for that to work, it may need to be within the cultural context, and maybe even within the teacher-student teaching lineage context of the different Buddhist traditions, I'm guessing. At least for most people. There may be these kind of super gifted people who can just take some techniques and go, but and I think the same thing goes for the ancient Platonist stuff. In other words, you can't sort of distill out a set of techniques and then be like, all right, here we go, theurgy, let's do it. Right. It's not going to work. It may be that beliefs about reality, even if they're sort of provisional, are part of the architecture, or are as much part of these sorts of disciplines as postures and rituals and other external stuff. You might have to have the right beliefs in position to channel consciousness in the right directions to get to a given state or place.
Yeah, that brings to mind one of Terence McKenna's riffs about how language is kind of a portal. Language is a portal for the logos to instantiate itself in this world. Like if you don't have the words for it and you don't have the concepts for it, it's not going to really make an impact, or you're not going to have a way with which to interact with the idea.
Yeah.
So for anything to become real, or for you to have a way to interact with it, you need words. But at the same time, I also think that, let's just, again, taking the realist point of view of what we were supposedly talking about throughout this whole conversation with subtle bodies and the idea that you can have realizations or experiences that are very different, yet very fundamental to what you really are on a more basic level. If we're taking that seriously, why wouldn't some people just be more sensitive in that respect, be more prone to having visions or experiences or going out of body naturally? And that's the lore actually behind this Monroe Institute. Is this Bob Monroe guy was this wealthy broadcasting executive, and he started having really scary things happening at night, where he would get these really uncomfortable sensations in his body, welling up of a mixture of feeling sick and hot and just am I having a heart attack? What's going on? So he goes to the doctor, and they're like, no, no evidence of anything. Maybe you should see a psychiatrist. Talks to a psychiatrist. Well, you had some neuroses, but there's nothing. So does everybody,
you're just a standard fucked up person.
Right. Yeah. So one night in bed, he's just like, okay, I'm going to go with it. Like, I guess it's not going to kill me, so I'll go with it. And that led to him having this like vision of like this luminescent thing in front of his face. And he's like, well, what is this? And then he realized it was the chandelier on his ceiling. And he was like gaining the POV of being above his body and like looking back down and feeling like he was literally on the roof of his room. And then it just goes from there. And he starts trying to explain, like, okay, what is this? And starts finding other people who have naturally had these experiences and starts being like, well, can we elicit it by doing this? Can we elicit it by doing that? This doesn't work. Well, this might work. Let's try this. That's how it all started, was from a natural weird experience. And then lo and behold, I mean, I even have friends close to me that, you know, now that I've started talking about this more on the show, they're like, oh, I told you about this happening to me like 2 years ago, right? And some people it just seems to happen to. So it almost seems like I kind of agree with McKenna's take and what we were just riffing on there, that it's got to be culturally and linguistically influenced to some degree. But also, if we are going to take the realist perspective on it, then it would just happen too, and we would be left grappling to voice language onto it to try to make sense of it.
Yeah, although the sort of out of body experience you're talking about strikes me as being actually pretty describable and sort of not going so far. It's weird, it's oogly boogly, but it's not in the realm of ineffable, the sort of stuff you get if you take like a heroic dose of some psychedelic, where you're like, I can put some of it into words, but mostly not. And then, you know, all you can do is kind of your friend over there who's also taking a heroic dose kind of nods sagely, and you both go, yeah, man, yeah. Because that's it. But it's actually pretty straightforward. Like, I was outside my body, I was looking down, there was my body sleeping, or there was the chandelier or whatever. But also an interesting thing. I'm quite interested in something I heard about years ago. I have no idea where. Which is that the because I honestly I haven't really looked into near-death experiences and stuff like that, even though it is very interesting. One expects both that there has been tons and tons of research into this. One also expects that mainstream psychology and so on would poo-poo any such evidence, no matter how scientifically rigorous it was. But that doesn't mean that there is necessarily good scientific research on this out there either. And I just don't know the answer. But I did hear somewhere that in some hospitals where people have these, near-death experiences quite often because they're lying on the operating table about to die of blood loss or having a hemorrhage or whatever, and then they come back sometimes when the doctors do their jobs and say, Doc, I was outside my body and I saw this light and blah, blah, blah. That on tops of like the cabinets in the operating theaters, they put weird random stuff. Have you heard this?
Yeah.
Like, just put some weird shit and then you can verify. You can say like, okay, you were up by the ceiling, right? Did you see the weird stuff on top of the cabinets? And if so, what was it? And I've never yet encountered a case where someone said, yeah, the weirdest thing is, on top of the cabinets was XYZ weird random bits of stuff. And the doctors are like, oh my God, that's exactly right. So this gets us back to the question of downloading, having the weird experience, the weird non-normal knowledge acquisition, but is it knowledge of a kind of objective reality? Is it knowledge where you can maybe get the, calculus or some kind of solid, useful advance on the knowledge we can just obtain through everyday means? Or is it something else? Is it some kind of, let's say, artifact of consciousness doing its thing, right?
Yeah. Well, a couple things. Like, I think this would be a fun thing to try to an inquiry to make with you, who has more knowledge of the specific words for these different subtle bodies, layers of, I don't know, instantiation or not instantiation or non-physical. So one, there's a book by a psychiatrist named Dr. Bruce Grayson, who I believe has done the most peer-reviewed work on near-death experiences out of anyone. I talked to this guy a few years ago. He came out with a book called, it might be After. It
Right.
might be called After. Um, and he is one of these guys who has been in the room with people who cardiac arrested, and or maybe he like came and spoke with them after and he was out of the room or something. But they have told him things that they could not have known through
Okay.
physical sight, like
Yeah.
about stain, like you were wearing this and you had a stain on your tie, like that kind of stuff. That's just
Yeah.
like, what? Um, but yeah, there's all kinds of stories that he goes into in that book. And I mean, this is a tenured professor at a, you know,
Hmm.
university and medical college. So this isn't just
Yeah.
like some guy saying my friend of a friend said this. And I have stories like that too, though, where a friend of a friend
Yeah.
supposedly had some experience, and it's like,
Yeah.
okay,
The only thing I would like, I have no trouble believing that that's possible at all. But before I go, yeah, wow, okay, proven. I want to get him not only repeating some anecdotes from his days hanging around
hmm,
the ICU ward, but also a statistical account of all the times people had a experience that was either like wrong, like you had this stain
yeah,
on your tie, and he's like, no, I didn't. I wasn't even wearing a tie, dickhead, and just reported nothing or reported like
yeah,
some kind of generic bright light kind of stuff. You know what I mean? And then add the
yeah,
two up, because then
totally,
you can maybe, if you wanted to, um, do a statistical analysis and say like, oh my god, this actually
for
is
sure.
really unusual, statistically significant anomaly, or it's cherry picked for the really good stuff.
Yeah. And from my POV as a living person, like I want that too. I don't want false hope. I want
Yeah,
hope of like there really is more, and I want the good shit. I want the, you know, the stuff that's been tested. But what it does, what for for whatever it's worth, what does seem to be consistent is when people do have these experiences is a sense of, I don't really care what you guys think. That was real. That was
yeah,
more real than this. I didn't want to come back. Like I, and it's like the amount of people who had a very bad experience, like they might have been scared and disoriented at first, but there's this almost immediate sense of something very, like a very comforting
yeah.
presence, guiding presence coming and being like, it's okay, remember this, and they're like, oh yeah, I remember this. That kind of a sense, which then again of course evokes all of more things I'd love to rap with you about, like the daimon and everything.
Mm.
Um But here's one thing that I think would be fun to try to do in terms of inquiry is if we were to try to map some of these states onto some of these different subtle bodies that are talked about in the Western esoteric tradition, like there, it seems to be in the contemporary near death stuff. There's like a non-physical body that has the components of the physical body. Like it's almost
Doctor Strange,
like a
astral body.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah. So is there a body like that
nah, not in
that's
Platonism. In
referred to?
Platonism, it's always
Okay.
spherical because
Yes.
they believe in non-corporeal movement, and they think both the soul and the nous, the consciousness itself, the higher mind, move in a circle, in a sphere. Whatever that means for things that do not occupy extended space or time, that is what they think. So that the pneumatic body, at least in its good state, in its non-damaged state, is going to be a spherical kind of rotating sphere. Um, that seems to be the consensus. I've never come across an astral body with arms and legs in a Platonist. The older, the Yatromantic tradition, we don't have enough details to really say. I mean, people leave their body in the form of a soul, and they can be seen sometimes by other people,
Ah.
and so they just look like
Oh.
themselves by location. We have a few of
Oh,
those
right,
accounts
right.
from the sort of 6th century Greeks. Also, one guy, he leaves his body, Aristeas of Proconnesos, I think he's called. He leaves his body in the form of a raven and goes flying around,
Yeah.
so he can take on an animal form. You get that kind of stuff as well. But I don't think we have. Well, maybe those guys are the closest thing to the Doctor Strange subtle body. Also, you have the traditional tale of the underworld journey, which Plato
Right.
riffs on in the myth of Earth, the end of the Republic, where, as far as you can tell, these are just, these all these dead people in the underworld are just people, right? even though
Yeah.
they don't have their normal
Hmm.
bodies anymore. They're walking around. They walk. They do other stuff that implies the existence of legs and feet and all that sort of thing. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is just my own imagination, I guess, but it seems like it makes sense to me that as you, like, if we're just to go through the thought exercise of imagining lifting off from the body, it sort of makes sense to imagine that. And I think maybe I've mentioned this in one of my emails, like even in that, in the Myths of Cosmic Ascent episode, you have this account from Plutarch.
Mm.
Um, there's all of this stuff that sounds very much like this, where there's a maybe I'm conflating stories in my head here, but anyway, like the idea of there being like a cord that attaches you to
Yeah.
your body, like that. Is that in that story?
That's in one of the three eschatological
Okay.
myths by Plutarch. I believe it's in the one on the face in the moon, but I will not swear to that. Where yeah,
Yeah.
you have this sort of
Yeah.
like umbilical cord attaching the soul to the
Yeah.
body.
Yeah. The
And you
silver cord. Yeah.
yeah.
I recommend everybody go listen to that episode of Earl's show. It's for whatever reason, that story about the ne'er do well who falls and like cracks his neck or whatever, and then
Yeah.
has the whole out of body experience and comes back as a different person. I've listened to that one so many times, man. There's just so many little glorious, scintillating things that both overlap with current tales about near death and out of body
Mm.
stuff, but also make me think about things like in the Phaedo, where Socrates is talking about like the true earth, and he mentions the planets in their true form being like more luminous, more beautiful, more animate. And I mean, that sounds like that, but it also sounds like stories you hear from people who do these out of body
Yeah.
journeys. And it does go far beyond, like the reports go far beyond just, oh, I'm out of my body and bumping up against the ceiling. I mean, it does get into,
Yeah.
deep, I mean, space travel and encounters with other beings. And even sitting here, like you may have the perception that I'm bought and sold on all these wooey things, Earl, but I'm not. Like I'm open-minded, and I go, I try to sniff. I give it the sniff test, and I'm like, who thinks this?
Yeah.
Give me
Yeah.
give me your best version of who thinks this. And if it's a sophisticated and it's believable, then I want to know. And then I keep digging and keep digging, and keep kind of, you know, doing a little archaeology on it until I'm like, I want to go deeper still, or I think I've gone deep enough into this one.
Mm.
And that's like kind of where I'm at with this out of body stuff. I have not experienced it. I don't know if I'm going to experience anything, but I know enough people. I know other people who have done these retreats, people involved. I've listened to interviews with Bob Monroe, and it's like, man, and like I mentioned, there's a CIA connection that's really weird.
There always
It,
is.
it right. Yeah.
Listen, let us know
yeah,
how it goes. Let us know how it goes.
for sure. I absolutely will, man.
That
I
would be really
absolutely will.
cool.
Um,
Pursuant to what you're saying earlier about, I'm going to throw cold water on this whole thing now for fun.
Go ahead. Yeah, that's
because
okay.
we love doing that. You know who else experiences that are undeniable, and they're like, look, I don't expect you to believe me, but if you were there, you would just
Mhm.
not even be able to deny it, even if you wanted to. You couldn't be skeptical, right? It's like you've taken
Schizophrenics.
a huge, well, schizophrenics, yeah.
Yeah.
But let's say you've taken a huge amount of mushrooms and you've just had this
Mhm.
mind-blowing experience, and you're like, oh my God, McKenna, I know what you were on about now. Yeah, there is no denying this, right? For me, a very instructive other case for this, which is not at all hip and psychedelic, is this lady I spoke to who was the mom of my friend, and she was like a Dutch Calvinist, and she was born
Mhm.
again in Jesus.
Yeah.
And she was, she wasn't trying to be preachy, but we were chatting, and she was like, somehow it came up in conversation, and she was trying to express to me how important it is that I should be born again in Jesus, because she's been there. It's undeniable experience of rebirth that not to tell me about it and try to get me to accept that for myself would be like keeping the greatest treasure imaginable away from me. A tear came to her eye. And, Dutch people tears don't come to their eyes very easily. She's not a very demonstrative person. She's not from a very demonstrative culture, but she was very clearly sincere. Like, look, there is this thing. It's universally true. It's available to you. You just have to accept Christ. And I have no doubt that her life was completely changed by this experience. I also have no that she wasn't taking psychedelics. She wasn't engaging in meditation. Right. She wasn't doing any of this kind of stuff. She just read the Bible, I guess, in church or whatever. And the Bible was enough to send her into this state of being reborn. What's the difference between that and the acquisition of the new noetic body that we get in Corpus Hermeticum 13?
Yes,
that's above my pay grade. But
could you actually just summarize that real quick for people that don't know? Because I was going to bring this up, this idea of attaining the new, like the sphere of nous, or awakening to this. Yeah.
I mean, there's well, first of all, let me say let me say that anyone who's interested in rebirth and the acquisition of subtle bodies definitely want to read the treatise 13 or tractate 13 in the collection of ancient Greco-Egyptian texts known as the Corpus Hermeticum, which you can find translated by Brian Copenhaver. You can find G.R.S. Mead's translation, which is actually excellent, despite the scorn people like to throw, all the shade they like to throw on the Theosophists. G.R.S. Mead was a serious head and deserves a lot of respect for his scholarly work. And also, people should just don't listen to my podcast about Plutarch's eschatological myths. Get the Loeb Classical Library Green Book series of Plutarch's Moralia. So Plutarch wrote a ton of stuff, but he has a kind of a few volumes called Moralia, which is just the general stuff that doesn't fit into the other big series he wrote. And in the Moralia, you will find the treatises on the face and the moon, on Socrates' daimonion, or De Genio Socratis in Latin, on Socrates' genius, and on why divine punishment is delayed. De Sera, it's called. Find those and read them in English translation, because it would blow your mind, kids. It's great stuff. It's amazing literature. But getting back to the Corpus Hermeticum, we have two hermetic texts from antiquity. One is Corpus Hermeticum 13, and the other one is not in the Corpus Hermeticum. It's a text that's only extant in Coptic, that comes from the Nag Hammadi trove that was found in Egypt, which is a enormous library of weird and wonderful, seemingly heretical Christian works that was found in some big jars in
this is where most of the Gnostic stuff comes from.
Most of our extant Gnosticism comes from here. And they were reading, whoever these guys were, they might have been monks. They were reading some very interesting stuff, including a text called, well, it doesn't have a title, but it's often called On the Ogdoad and the Ennead, or The Ogdoad Reveals the Ennead, which is like a line from the text, or On the Eighth and the Ninth. But in that work, we are given a picture of a ritual context in which a hermetic teacher has a student, and he is sort of talking him through a process of transformation whereby, and sometimes in my mind I mix up Corpus Hermeticum 13 and On the 8th and 9th, but let me see if I can get this right. He's talking him through this process whereby the human being is subject to the 12 tormentors. We don't know who they are, but chances are it's the signs of the zodiac, right?
It sounds like it.
And from a realm higher than the cosmos, beyond the 9th sphere, right? So you've got 7 planetary spheres. The 8th sphere are the fixed stars. What's the 9th going to be? The Ennead? Well, that's going to be where God is found. This is probably the nous, if we're going to go by normal hermetic precedent. The nous, or the 9th, is going to send down 10 like liberating immaterial powers. and the student is going to sort of internalize those. They're going to drive away the 12 tormentors, thus rendering the living human embodied hermetic practitioner somehow free of astral fate, astral influence, and all of the baggage that goes with that to the late antique mind. Now, that's hard to get our modern minds into because we don't even know what fate meant to the ancients, but it's wrapped up in, I guess, a modern way of thinking about it would be like the laws of physics. Like,
Right.
we're going to free you from the laws of physics. You're not going to be constrained by this material stuff anymore, even though you seemingly still are a hermetic student sitting across from you in this room. So that's on the 8th and the 9th. It's a very beautiful, very vexing, wonderful work from antiquity.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, it really is. Yeah.
and even more
Sorry,
baffling
cutting
and
you off.
more in the subtle body side of things that you're interested in and I'm interested in Corpus Hermeticum 13. In fact, I might even just call up the actual text here and read this for a second because it's
Beautiful.
oh so good. Let's see here. Subtle body and
On a related
antiquity.
note, is there any good online resource that you go to for texts, or is it multiple?
I'd say multiple. Um,
Okay.
uh, what you do find a lot of online is English translations that are out of copyright. So things like GRS
Yeah, right.
Mead's translation, easily found. Um, Great stuff to be had. It's hard to be critical. There are, at the risk of, well, I'm just going to go ahead and say that the Schwepp, which is my podcast, The Secret History of Western Esotericism, if you go on there and click on info and then click on
Yeah.
resources, I try to keep a decent selection of online resources that I think are useful, and often with a little description. Like, this site has a whole load of crap, but it also has some really good stuff on it. Or this site's
Hmm.
amazing. It's got really good, critical texts of these body of things. So that's always like an ongoing process. But I mean, it might be a good starting place insofar as I link to other sites that then
Yeah.
themselves will give you, like, say you're interested in Hermetica, I'll have a link to like an online Hermetica forum that will have a ton of other links to really good sources. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah, and you do a great job of that. I mean, you do all the stuff that I wish I did better. Like you actually cite things and like have actually read all the stuff ahead of time so you know what you're talking about on a very very deep level. So yeah, everybody use this as a resource for sure.
But see, I just totally screwed up my 8th and the 9th and my Corpus Hermeticum 13. Going back to the text. So Corpus Hermeticum 13:3, let's start with that. This is the rebirth passage in my translation. So the Hermetic teacher has been talking to his student, talking about this body, this immortal body that you can get. And he sort of gets the body. And he says, quote, "What can I say, my child? I
Yeah.
can't express it except by saying this. Seeing a figureless vision, which arose in myself from God's mercy, I have even gone out of myself and into an immortal body, and am now not what I was before, but have been conceived in nous." We learn later in 14 that he says, I'm now invisible, even though you see me, and this body is made of the 10 powers who have driven out the 12. So that stuff I was attributing to the Ogdad reveals the Ennead. No, wrong. The noetic body and the 12 tormentors being driven out by the 10 powers is from Corpus Hermeticum 13. What we get in the Ogdoad reveals the Ennead, or treatise on the 8th and the 9th, which is to be found in Nag Hammadi Corpus 6:6. Is again a ritual context. You have a teacher and a student, and and you're sort of, it's like we're being given a sort of bird's eye view on, like we're a fly on the wall at a hermetic ritual, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
There's prayers, there's hymns, there's an explanation of spiritual. So there's a lot of philosophy in these texts as well. And then you have a visionary ascent, which it consists of a prayer for Hermes to receive the power to speak, the advent of the light power, and the first vision of Tat. Tat is the student here.
Oh.
Tat sings a hymn in silence. There's a lot of silent hymns in the Hermetica, which is a wonderful and interesting thing, which you also find in late Platonism. Tat attains a vision of the Ogdoad and the Ennead. That's the 8th and the 9th. Then he sings a hymn of praise, and in a sort of epilogue, he erects a votive stela, which is a nice touch of Egyptian. This is what you do in Egypt when you've had a great vision. You erect a stela and carve some
that's cool.
sacred hieroglyphics onto it. And then what's actually in the vision itself? It's sort of Christian Bull, great scholar of the Hermetica, breaks it down this way. There's an invocation of the invisible God. There's a bunch of voces magicae, these sort of unintelligible god names that we get in ancient Greek magical papyri and stuff, and magical traditions more generally. There's a petition for wisdom to sing the vision of the Ogdoad and the Ennead. So asking for the words, right? Which gets back to what you were saying about McKenna. It's going I'm getting into this ineffable territory, but please give me the words so I can actually lay out this vision. There's an argument that they have already, the teacher and the student have already reached the hebdomad on the way to God, the seventh sphere, the 7th realm or whatever. There's a petition to see the image of truth, and that God receives the mark of the fullness. Then there's a kind of excursus on how God has created everything, a sort of discourse on how amazing God is and his universality. A petition that God receive the speech offering and give salvation and wisdom, and a conclusion whereby the teacher and the student who have now attained to this highest vision embrace each other. So that's kind of what's going on in the treatise on the 8th and the 9th.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And real quick, and I think we're bumping up against your Cinderella moment here.
Yeah.
In terms of time, but it almost reminds me, I've never thought about this before, but in my previous day job, I was like a security and network engineer. And it almost reminds me of TCP/IP, like the way internet protocol works, because it's there's the petitions and the confirmations and the sending the information back, and all of these things that they do to make it official and make sure it's error free, and you're not going to drop information. It was almost reminding me of that in some ways.
All right. There you go. Yeah.
But man, I have a million more things I would love to riff with you about, but I know we're out of time. And
yes, sir.
Thank you so much for yeah, go ahead.
It's been a pleasure chatting with you. Thank you for inviting me on. And yeah, it's rare that I get that I'm actually actively invited to just ramble on about the stuff that I'm really into. So this is a delight for me, obviously.
I love it, man. And I would love to do it again anytime. Everybody, I cannot recommend the Schwepp to you enough. It is, if you're interested in the esoteric, but you feel I don't know where to start. I don't know if this is good information or where this information's come. If you're in that soup, go to this podcast. This starts, it's linear. It takes you chronologically through the history of Western esotericism. Obviously, Earl is brilliant as a guide, so just do it. I can't recommend it enough.
You're too kind. Thank you so much.
You're too kind for putting in the sweat, my friend. I really hope to do this again with you, and thanks so much for being generous with your time too.
Peace.